Welcome to Economics Applied, podcast sponsored by the Hoover Institution. My name is Stephen Davis, host of the show. Our guest today is Ayşegül Şahin, one of the world's foremost researchers at the intersection of macroeconomics and labor economics. She holds the Richard J. Gonzalez Regents Chair in Economics at the University of Texas, Austin. Before joining the UT faculty, she spent more than a decade at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and she continues to consult widely with researchers and policymakers in the Federal Reserve System. She is also the new editor of the American economic journal, Macroeconomics, which holds a special place in my professional heart. So welcome, Ayşegül. It's wonderful to have you on the show.
It's a pleasure to be here, Steve. Thank you for the invitation.
Sure. So we've both written at some length about the behavior of U.S. labor markets since the COVID-19 pandemic struck our lives 4 years ago. And we're going to get to your interpretation and explanation of some of these recent labor market developments. But first, let's just set the stage for our conversation. So let me ask you to briefly recount for us the main U.S. labor market developments since March 2020. What happened and in what respects was it really unusual?
Well, as economists, we love saying this time is different, but I'm going to say this time really was different. When I look back over the last 4 years, I see a lot of defining features of this period. The first is how deep and abrupt the recession was. I'm sure you remember in early March 2020, you visited Austin for a seminar, and we discussed how the US labor market finally was in a good place after more than a decade of persistent weakness and unemployment, participation, wage growth. But we found ourselves in April 2020 with almost 15% unemployment rate. And after that, the recovery was also very brisk. We reached 5% unemployment rate in about a year. And remember, after the Great Recession, we got there after 7 years.
Right.
And when I look at other aspects, one thing that really stands out is despite all the disruptions related to the pandemic and our everyday life being disrupted, workers started quitting their jobs at a record high rate. And we have not seen anything like that before, especially after the Great Recession. And that's why we call it the Great Resignation now. On the firm side, also, we started seeing that employers told us it's very hard to fill vacancies. We can't hire people. There are labor shortages. When we look at wage dynamics, it also was different. We are typically used to seeing high wage workers doing well during strong labor markets. This time we have seen the trend being the opposite, with low wage workers seeing growth higher than high wage workers, leading to what David Autor calls wage compression. But obviously, on top of everything, there was a widespread adoption of remote work opportunities. Telecommuting, the concept, goes back to the 1970s, but before the pandemic, that wasn't something that we thought about doing at this capacity. And even after things normalized, after 4 years, we settled at a much higher rate in terms of remote work in our daily lives. So these are the main defining features of this period. And I think especially having been through the Great Recession and having studied that period like yourself, I think these were really very different compared to what we were used to seeing in the labor market.
Yeah, so you reminded me, we went out to dinner in Austin, and was it early March 2020?
Yes,
early March. We didn't wear masks, and we actually went to a restaurant.
Yes,
that was the last. That was the last normal period in life for some time. Yeah, so I remember that well, and it was a fun trip. It was my last trip for a long time, as I'm sure it was for.
It was our last
many
in-person
others.
seminar for
Yes.
2 years.
Okay, well, good to end on a high note, at least for me. So,
Definitely.
So you talked about, so let's just break down and a few of the things you said. So we had massive shutdown in the economy. starting in the second half of March. So just a couple of weeks after I was in Austin. We understand why that happened, at least in approximate sense. It was a combination of people's fear of contagion and mandatory restrictions that government authorities promulgated on both commerce and social activity. That led, as you said, to a huge increase in unemployment, followed by a very brisk recovery. Much of that was just the unwinding of a bunch of temporary layoffs. So we had this huge spike in temporary layoffs, and many people, not everybody by any means, but many people resumed their old employment relationships. And that part of the recovery was indeed very brisk, completely different than the aftermath of the Great Recession, and really different in terms of the role of temporary layoffs and their reversal than other, it was more extreme than other post-war US recessions, okay? So then you talked about these quits, and I just want to emphasize, quits were extraordinarily high, even by the standards of other tight labor markets. So, by the time we got well into second half of 2021 and 2022, there had been a lot of recovery. Labor markets were tight by many indicators, but even conditional on that, quits were really high. Okay, so that was really unusual. And another really unusual thing, I want to add to what you said. You stressed that wage growth was high at the bottom end of the wage distribution, but not at the top end. I think that's exactly right. But also overall wage growth in 2022 and 2023 have been, in real terms, has been pretty anemic for such a tight labor market.
It's really surprising, given other indicators of the labor market, how tight the labor market is, and we are still not seeing much higher wage growth. I agree with
exactly.
you. Yeah,
so these are all very unusual characteristics. And you also mentioned, and I agree with this assessment as well, there are many employers out there that claim they can't find labor. Vacancy durations were at all-time highs. Again, even conditional on the tightness of the labor market, very high vacancy durations, lots of indicators that some employers at least, and I think we have an explanation for this, we're having a really tough time filling those roles. So, and again, very low unemployment rate. Once we got back to the second half of 2021, early 2022, and these temporary layoffs were gone, the unemployment rate's been low. And certainly we would have been thrilled to have unemployment rates like this in the years after the Great Recession.
Definitely, this is not just a regular, very tight labor market. There is something else that is affecting all these indicators that we are talking about. In addition to the tight labor market. Obviously, labor market has been doing well, unemployment rate is low, but we think there are other factors.
Okay, so we've built up the suspense as well as two economists can do. What was the other factor? What take the rabbit out of the hat now. What is it, and explain how it worked and why you think it's a key element.
Well, as labor economists, we know, and we always emphasize that a job is not only wage. There are other things that workers care about: benefits, workplace safety, flexible schedules, location, commute time, etc. And we have a new paper with Sadika Baga, Lucas Mann, and Gianluca Violante, where we argue that the pandemic-induced remote work is an important addition to this amenity list that workers started caring about after the pandemic. So they really realized that the ability to be able to work remotely gives them this additional flexibility, better work-life balance, and this is something they started caring about when they look for a job or when they decide to move from one job to the other. So we think that's really the missing element of the puzzle. Once you take that into account, a lot of these things that we talked about started making a lot of sense. And
Agreed.
One example that I can give you as a parent is, imagine this midday dental appointment for our kids. It's required possibly 2 back and forth trips to our offices to attend a meeting in the morning and one in the afternoon, picking up our kids, and which pretty much wasted all our day just to attend 2 meetings. But now with remote work, it's just a slightly longer lunch break. And this kind of flexibility changed the way that workers started valuing their jobs. And we think that this really was an important change in the labor market after the pandemic. In your excellent survey with Barrero and Nick Bloom, actually, you give us the value of this. You ask workers how much they value this possibility, the possibility of working from home 2 or 3 days a week. Some don't care. There's some dispersion. Some really like to go back to the traditional work arrangements, but a great deal of them actually care about this, and they are willing to take wage cuts on average 8 to 10% to be able to work from home. So this is definitely a new amenity that entered into workers' valuation of the jobs after we had to all work from home. That's how we view remote work.
So and by the way, both the papers that Ayşegül mentioned, we'll put links to them on the Hoover Institution website for this podcast. So if you want to follow up, you can do that. So a couple things. There were some people who had the opportunity to work remotely before the pandemic, but it was pretty unusual, especially in what we would think of as good jobs. Okay. And so the really big shift is now many, not everyone, but many people in many occupations and in many organizations have the opportunity to work remotely at least a couple days a week, if that's what they want. And I agree with your assessment. There's lots of evidence that that is a very, very valuable job attribute for many people. And so they're willing to take some cut in compensation, or they're willing to go somewhere else for the same pay to get that. And maybe that leads into, resolving one of the puzzles you mentioned earlier about the Great Resignation. So why don't you speak to that and explain how is it that this sudden expansion in the opportunities to remote work led to the Great Resignation?
You mentioned that the early phase of the pandemic was very different. We had workers on temporary layoffs and some of them came back. But then we started seeing this wave of quits. And that's pretty much the time where we had a lot of dispersion in work arrangements. Some firms remain fully remote. Some of them said you have to come back fully on site. And there were a lot of hybrid opportunities. And a lot of workers also changed their evaluation of their jobs. And some of them found themselves mismatched to the amenity that the job is offering, as you said, because they had to go back to the office, but they had set up a different lifestyle, which was working way better with the possibility of remote work. So as a result, because of this mismatch, they started looking for other opportunities. And they left behind some jobs that required on-site involvement or being in person. And we think that part of the quits, obviously, it was a good labor market and there's always search for better wages, but part of this quits was an attempt in climbing the amenity ladder. We typically talk about the job ladder as a wage ladder, but especially after the pandemic, we realized that there's actually another ladder, the amenity ladder. And some workers value this a lot. So part of the quits are driven by this amenity search to be able to have a work-life balance. And we think that Great Resignation cannot be only explained with a tight labor market. There's definitely a shift in workers' valuation of their jobs.
Yeah, well, so we're as the audience is probably, we're very much on the same page in our interpretation of these developments and the emphasis on this newfound menu of amenity-rich jobs, amenity-rich in terms of flexibility and commute time, how often you have to commute, and so on. But explain then, so that kind of connects directly to the Great Resignation, but how is it, or is it the case that this explosion of jobs, opportunities that have amenities that people value fed into overall wage growth? Why has it been sluggish during a period of such real wage growth been sluggish during a period of such tight labor markets?
So as you know, there is high correlation between the types of works that can be done remotely and the wage of the typical wage of the job. And what we think is that the wage ladder was very important, especially for workers who did not have this option. There are some jobs, we always talk about dentists today, but you really need to be in person when you go to the dentist. So some of them really follow the traditional wage ladder. And that's why we have started seeing reasonable wage growth, meaningful wage growth for low wage workers. But on the high wage side, this amenity became a more important part relative to wages, because those workers actually have done pretty well after the Great Recession as well, but they started going after the amenity ladder. So that kept wage growth relatively low for that group of workers. And this relocation was huge. I mean, again, going back to one of your papers, around 5% of work days were work from home before the pandemic. Now it's stabilized close to at around 30%, if I remember right. So that's a huge reallocation. But that reallocation, which typically happens in pursuit of wages, this time happened in pursuit of better amenities,
Right.
especially for high wage workers.
Right. And just to put some context as to why this amenity is so valuable, the average American worker who commutes to work spends about 60 minutes in commute time each day they go to work. Tends to be a little bit higher for higher wage people because they live a little farther out on average and in bigger, nicer homes and commute longer. People also spend another 10 or 15 minutes grooming and getting ready for the day when they commute into the office than when they stay at home. So we're talking about something like 60 to 70 minutes time saving per day. That's for the average person. And for some people, it's much more than that. Some people may save 90 minutes, 2 hours out of their day if they work from home as compared to going to the office. Well, 2 hours is worth a lot, especially if you're already earning a lot and you pay high marginal tax rate. That's the second point I wanted to get to, is it's not, you also have monetary savings. Okay, when you don't commute, it's the commute, the monetary cost of the commute, it's the out-of-pocket cost for lunch, it's maybe a better wardrobe and so on. All of these costs can be foregone if you stay at home instead of going to the office. So this has a lot of value to people, and it's more valuable, other things equal, for people who pay higher tax rates, because you're basically shifting your compensation from a taxed form of compensation to an untaxed form of compensation if you move from a high wage job to one that pays a little bit less but doesn't require you to commute as much. And the other thing to note here, you've already made this, but I'll just make it in a different way. It tends to be well-educated, high earners who are more likely to have a job that makes it possible to work remotely. These jobs are very much concentrated in the information technology sector, finance, insurance, business services, some entertainment fields, and so on, where people are producing digital content. So it's an uneven distribution, but it's very powerful in some sectors, and the sectors where it's most powerful tend to be the ones, as you said earlier, that have high earnings and had done pretty well earnings-wise for at least a couple decades before the pandemic hit.
Yeah, it is incredibly difficult to buy time. And this is literally foregoing some wage growth for having time that one can spend with the family or at home or reading. It's really an important part of our lives now, the ability not to be able to commute to every meeting that we have to attend.
Right. And you mentioned there's the time-saving aspect of it, but I want to reiterate something you've already spoken to, which is the flexibility. The flexibility in how you use your time over the day. And just as your example illustrated, that aspect of it is especially important for people who have children. young children who aren't old enough to go to the dentist by themselves. So we see this very clearly in the survey data of people who say that who express a strong desire to work from home, their willingness to accept pay cuts to work from home. The actual time spent working from home is highest for people in their 30s and early 40s. So there's the time saving aspect of it. There's the flexibility and time management. And there are also other important benefits for some groups of people who have mobility impairments. Maybe they're in a wheelchair, or they have serious back pain. So going to the office 1 or 2 days a week might be manageable, but 5 days a week is just an enormous difficulty for them. So there are many people, sometimes for different reasons, who place high value on this ability to work in a more flexible way in terms of time and location.
It definitely reduced the cost of participating in the labor market, the ability to have more flexible schedules.
Yeah, and on that point, I think the evidence is still unfolding, but there is some emerging evidence, you're probably aware of it, that participation rates for women of childbearing age and women with children have recovered especially strongly since the pandemic. And labor force participation rates for people who have some physical impairments, as revealed in these surveys, is also up much more than labor force participation rates of other people. So these are exactly the groups that you would think will especially value the flexibility aspect of this big shift to work from home. So explain, though, I don't think you quite covered this yet. Explain, though, why is it that some employers were having so much trouble filling their jobs? And why is it that vacancy durations, especially for some employers in some fields, became so long? What's the story there? There's a competitive story there, but we haven't really articulated it fully.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, because as you know, we have seen job openings hit 12 million in 2022, as opposed to being around 7-8 million, even in very tight labor markets. So that looked very unusual. And at the same time, these vacancies became harder to fill. So to connect this to our discussion, I think we should remind ourselves what a job opening means. Our main source of job opening statistics is the so-called JOLTS, job openings and labor turnover survey. And a job opening is a position that a firm is actively trying to fill.
Right.
So we typically think of this as new positions. A firm opens a position and posts a vacancy. But actually, many of them are jobs that are left behind by workers who quit for better opportunities. And we just discussed that there was this huge wave of quits. And this is happening in a tight labor market. So firms found themselves with a lot of vacant jobs that they wanted to fill because the economy was doing so well. But these were left behind because workers who had them found better opportunities, possibly with better amenities, with remote work possibilities. So as a result, we got stuck with a lot of vacancies that were harder to fill because it required finding workers who didn't value these options that much. And we see a lot of evidence for this channel in the data. When we look at excess quits, excess vacancies, they are higher in less teleworkable industries. And job filling rates are higher in more teleworkable industries. So we see this channel being operative. And one way to also make sense of the data is after March 2022, we started vacancies going down, and we didn't see much of a change in the economy. But it's also the time where remote work started to stabilize. So there were less of these unwanted or hard to fill vacancies in the economy. So again, thinking about vacancy statistics from this point of view makes a lot of sense to me, because the vacancy here is also signaling the difficulty in hiring. not only the intention to hire. So it's not necessarily new positions coming in, but a lot of them are harder to fill vacancies that we keep counting over and over again in the data.
So let me add to that in a couple of respects. I think it's worth, so I basically agree with your assessment that let's call them old-fashioned jobs that offered no flexibility in when and where you worked suddenly looked a lot less attractive to many people. So some of those jobs were left vacant because their previous occupants quit. They were hard to fill because there are now these other nice jobs out there that have these other amenities, and people were going to those. So the long vacancy durations were concentrated in these kind of old-fashioned jobs.
Exactly.
That's point one. But point two is it's worth just taking note that it's not so easy for many organizations to shift the nature of the job. So it's not like I just turn on a switch and say, okay, this job used to be one where people had to be in the office 5 days a week. And now we figured out during the pandemic, they could work remotely some of the time. So let's only make them come back 2 days a week. And the reason it's not so easy is because there are many other aspects of the way the organization operates that are typically predicated upon people being in a physical location together, working together so they can communicate effectively. So that you think about, what does a manager do? A manager's, he's skilled at communicating, perhaps he's skilled at communicating face-to-face, evaluating performance. And now the manager says, well, what do I do if most of my staff is not on site most of the time? I don't know how to manage them. I don't know how to evaluate their performance. I don't know how to give them feedback. I don't know how to create a career ladder that works for the ambitious, better employees. So managers have to learn new skills in many cases, not all cases. Some of them, perhaps it comes easily too, but for many managers, the post-pandemic world is a very different place, requiring a very different skill set. And organizations have to adapt their HR practices for evaluation of how people are performing, feedback, and so on, to deal with an environment where many workers are not there most of the time. So it's not, the point I'm trying to make is, it's not just that these organizations were just somehow failing to recognize the new reality, but it's difficult to go from one management style, one set of organizational practices, especially in a larger company, to different managerial styles, different organizational practices. But that's often what it requires to make hybrid working arrangements and fully remote working arrangements work. And that's why this process has been unfolding for such a long time.
And there are other constraints as well. I think we all agree that we want schools to be in person. That's an experiment that didn't go that well.
Right. Thoroughly agree with that.
Yeah, you might be teaching Spanish at a high school, which is going to remain in person, but then you might decide, okay, maybe I should teach Spanish online, which has become very popular. A lot of language classes are being taught online. So for the worker, there's actually flexibility in terms of doing pretty much the same thing in a different format. But for the school, the format is fixed because that's something that we value a lot, being in person. I think all of these, as you described, took a while to unfold after the pandemic.
And just to build on that point further, two observations. Most organizations, not all, but most organizations that have some capacity for their workers to work remotely have gravitated towards a mostly hybrid model, or combination of hybrid and traditional. And that's because you can't do everything effectively, at least not very easily, in a fully remote environment. So there's still a big role for physical interactions, but the remote interactions often work better when people occasionally get together and socialize, get to know each other, establish rapport, understand something about where their teammates or bosses and subordinates and so on are coming from. So, finding that right balance does take time and practice, and it's going to be a different balance for different organizations and different kinds of people. So we've moved from a world where there's like one flavor of ice cream. Everybody gets vanilla. That is, they come into the office 5 days a week. Everybody knows how that works. how to make it work, managers, the employees, to now there isn't just two alternatives, there's many alternatives, from the extreme of the old-fashioned traditional 5 days a week on site to everybody in the company is fully remote. That's still quite unusual, but there's a whole range of alternatives in between, with some kind of hybrid arrangement, but details differ. So there's just an enormous increase in the variety and complexity of working arrangements, and it takes time to adjust to that.
And also, things are changing for people as well. We mentioned people with young kids, for example. When you're single, you might have a different preference. As we get older, commute might start to look different. So there are also life cycle events that used to always happen, but now there's this new possibility in terms of picking the right job for people that varies over time. So this reallocation, I think, was really triggered by the pandemic, and we have seen how it has been evolving in the last 4 years. And once you start thinking of this as the most important thing that happened in the last 4 years, I think the labor market developments start to make much more sense.
Right. So I want you to put on your monetary policy maker hat for the rest of our conversation now. So we haven't talked yet about monetary policy, but it's been a very unusual and challenging time for monetary policy as well.
Definitely.
Part of the challenge had to do with whether it was the unusual character of the pandemic shock and its unfolding. That part's obvious, but also just for the central bank to diagnose what was happening in labor markets, and from that make judgments about monetary policy decisions with respect to interest rates and other monetary policy tools. So speak to that. Explain how this conversation, the changes in the labor market that you and I think we now understand pretty well, but that's 4 years after the fact. We've been studying it. How did that complexify the task facing the monetary policymakers during the past 4 years?
I think there's a tendency to just pick indicators for each episode. And we tend to think like, oh, this time we should look at vacancies. This time we should look at this, we should look at that. I think it's really important to try to understand why different indicators deviate from each other. We know, for example, unemployment and vacancies move in opposite direction, the so-called beverage curve. But in the last 2 years, vacancies keep coming down, unemployment remains constant. So does this mean that unemployment is immune to labor demand? I don't think so. But what we are seeing is really the unfolding of this big shock that triggered this reallocation. And in my view, the Fed had to deal with two pandemic-related shocks. One was the global supply chain disruptions, and we know which contributed to the inflation and the disinflation a great deal. And the second is the change in workers' preferences related to the emergence of remote work. And in my view now, we are seeing that both of them are kind of unfolded. And that's why I expect that the usual trade-offs will be back. We will start seeing unemployment and vacancies moving in opposite directions. So I think it's very easy to just focus on things that we think is telling us a story. But instead, we should really look at what's really happening under the hood and differences and similarities between different business cycles.
So in terms of your earlier discussion, vacancy rates were extremely high, vacancy durations were extremely long, even relative to the low unemployment rates we had. Some people would look at that and say, wow, there's just enormous demand for labor. That's going to provide huge wage inflationary pressures. And what I think you're saying is, well, no, don't be so hasty about that. Because as we discussed, vacancy rates were unusually high, and vacancies were taking an unusually long time to fill during this period because of this unusual nature of the reallocation associated with the amenity value shock. And once you understood that and how it distinguished this cyclical episode from really any prior cyclical episode, I think in modern US history, then you would say that would give you a different take on these really high vacancy rates, really high vacancy to unemployment rates. And you'd say, well, maybe there's not likely to be as much wage pressure.
But it might also tell you that wage pressures might even come later, because if
Right.
this reallocation on the amenity ladder is almost done, the usual job ladder
Yes.
considerations might bring us firmer wage. Yeah.
Yeah, you've made an important but subtle point. And
Mm-hmm.
I want to state it explicitly because we didn't state it explicitly before. This role of the amenity value, the newfound amenity opportunities in jobs, and how it restrained wage growth pressure, that is a transition phenomenon. It only persists as long as we're in this kind of reallocation phase where we're going from workers and employers are matched in the old way to their resorting. And that's why I like to call it the great resorting or great reshuffling, not the great resignation, that we're resorting to a new set of employer worker matches where now we can match on this amenity dimension as well. It's as that process is unfolding that you get the something that's pulling down wage growth pressures. But once that process is over, there's no reason to expect you're going to have the same favorable effect on wage growth as you did during the transition. And that's what you mean when you say the old relationships are likely to reemerge.
Exactly. And obviously, this always happens in the economy. There are a lot of people who move to lower paid jobs because it's closer to their parents, etc. But what was unusual in this episode was the scale of it,
Right.
And the timing that it happened all at the same time. And it was also reinforced with a tight labor market, because there were a lot of opportunities coming up for everyone, and some of them offer this amenity.
Okay, anything else you want to add to our lightning conversation here?
Well, it was a lot of fun, as always, and we studied the Great Recession together, and I'm so happy that now we discuss what happened in the last 4 years.
Yep. All right. Thanks so much, Ayşegül. It's been a pleasure. And
Definitely. Thank you.
take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.